Good evening. My name is Pat Kowitzel. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening and welcome you to a virtual author program with the author, Dr. Laura Morelli. I'd like to welcome those of you that are joining us for the very first time. I think that we have a number of people that may be attending your first author program or your first virtual author program from Magic City Books tonight. And so welcome. We do these a couple of times a week, pretty much every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday from now until Thanksgiving or less. We have events going on, and you can check out the other upcoming events at magiccitybooks.com and see what all is on the way. We've got local authors and a few celebrities as well, including the Academy Award winning actor Matthew McConaughey. Coming up in a couple of weeks, he has a new book out called Green Lights, and one of his 5 or 6 American tour stops is going to be with us here in Tulsa for a virtual event. And he's mostly in conversation with some big name actor friends of his. And we hear that there's going to be an announcement very soon about who he will be talking to for our event in Tulsa. So that event is Monday, October 26th. Tickets are on sale now at magiccitybooks.com. Nearly every other event, in fact, I believe every other event that we have scheduled right now is a free event, just like tonight, hosted on the Zoom platform or on Facebook Live. And we've got some folks over there watching right now on Facebook Live. We also record these events and post them to our YouTube channel, and you can search Magic City Books on YouTube and see any of our past events that way. A couple of, I guess it's almost 2 months ago now, I was in the store right after we had kind of reopened to the public a little bit, and we had one of our roundtable customers came in, and she was picking up some books and said to me, I have an author that I'd really like you guys to consider bringing in, because I've read her previous book. I thought it was wonderful. I have seen her speak. I don't know if it was in person or just online, but she had seen this author speak and said, I think that it'd be a really good program, and you should look into doing it. And that author was Laura Morelli, and here we are tonight. I looked up Laura online, found an email for her on her website, sent her an email about being excited about the book, and then here we are. So that was just a really fortuitous kind of conversation that happened, and a way that we were able to connect, and something that was really only possible in this virtual event space. Laura's joining us tonight from North Carolina, and sometimes there's an opportunity to be able to travel for books, and sometimes there's less of an opportunity, and sometimes authors happen to be someplace for a different reason altogether, and we're able to get authors that are in Tulsa for some other reason. We've done that a lot with people that are doing research either at the Woody Guthrie Center or the Bob Dylan Center, people who are doing something at Philbrook Museum or some other cultural institution in our city, and we're able to kind of partner and get that book event going. But this was kind of a unique opportunity to be able to do this without any of those components necessarily at play right away. We're also joined tonight by some of the leadership and many of the subscribers of Tulsa Town Hall. And many of you attended the Robert Edsel event last November, where he talked about the Monuments Men and gave a really riveting lecture back last November. And when we booked this event, one of the first folks I reached out to was Kathy Collins at Tulsa Town Hall about the potential for kind of that connection that a lot of people really enjoyed Robert Edsel's talk last year. And if they did, this is a book that's going to be right up their alley and taking it on to kind of another step. And so we welcome all of you that are joining us from that Tulsa Town Hall audience. Finally, we are really lucky to have such a great partnership with Philbrook Museum, and Susan Green is our moderator tonight. Susan is an associate or assistant associate.
Associate. It's the title.
Curator
of
special collections. Yeah. That's right. And Susan reminded me that the very first author program that Booksmart Tulsa launched about 11 years ago was actually held at Philbrook. And for the last 11 years, when we've done in-person author programs throughout the city, Many of them in the last few years have been at the store because we have that beautiful dedicated event space, the Algonquin room there in the store. But for larger events and just, because of our rich history with institutions in Tulsa, houses of worship, museums, galleries, restaurants, theaters. We have done a lot of author events in a lot of other places. And I know that there's a lot of folks that, they haven't been to Philbrook in a while and they come for a Booksmart Tulsa or Magic City Books event and kind of are reminded of what a great resource that is in our community, or the Contemporary 108 or Circle Cinema or the synagogue or any of a number of places. And so thank you, Susan, for joining us tonight.
Really?
We are here to talk about the night portrait. I've got my copy right here, and
Got my copy.
that's right. We're all with copies tonight. This is a kind of a dual narrative book that goes back and forth and between World War II and events happening around that time, and 15th century Italy and the events that are happening at the creation of a masterpiece. And so I will hand it off to Susan now, and please give a warm Magic City Books welcome to Dr. Laura Morelli and Susan Green from Philbrook Museum. Thank you all very much for joining us. Enjoy the show.
Thank you so much, Pat. That was a rousing introduction. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm just thrilled. And I love the fact that this all started with a reader walking into the bookstore and recommending a book. I mean, how awesome is that? It sent a chill down my spine to hear that story. So I just think that's the best.
There
Thank
are
you.
absolutely readers in town, and you have fans in town. That's always wonderful to know. And I'm honored to have been asked. So Philbrook Museum of Art had been closed during portions of the pandemic. Our gardens have been open for visitors, and it has been really a lovely respite for people to come and visit. But just this week, we've opened to the public our special exhibition, and we've opened our villa galleries. And we've been immersed in portraiture. So I've been living with the idea of hanging one of our galleries with portraits, the idea of looking at a face and trying to discover who was depicted, what's the story behind them, and how did this work of art come to us? And it was just such an absolute pleasure to read the night portrait. And this book all revolves around one portrait.
Yes, I also have been fascinated with portraits for many years. When I was in graduate school, I used to go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I worked there for a little bit as a docent when I was young. And I used to love going into the portrait galleries because, as you say, it's just, an opportunity to look at a single person, a single individual, and immediately your mind is filled with questions about who they were and how they lived and why they were captured in this particular way in a particular time. And Leonardo da Vinci's portrait of the lady with the ermine is just a picture that has fascinated me for a long time. If you aren't familiar with the picture, it is I have just a little black and white. If you Google Leonardo da Vinci, lady with the ermine, you'll say, oh yes, I recognize that portrait. It's a famous portrait by Leonardo that was done in the 1490s.
Mm-hmm. And you've really crafted this compelling story that starts at the painting's inception. So you're telling the story of Leonardo and the model and their lives, and how this woman becomes the subject of one of Leonardo's paintings. And then you allow us to come forward to the early mid 20th century into the Nazi era, the World War II. And so you combine these two eras in this wonderful balance, in this wonderful way of interweaving the stories. And your previous books are really centered in Italy. And of course, Leonardo and Cecilia are they're living in Italy, but there's so much of this book set in Germany and in Poland. So what sparked the creation of this book? How did you get interested in working with the idea of the Nazi era and combining it with Leonardo?
Well, I am always inspired by research, but this book came about in a little bit of a different way. I have a son who is a World War II enthusiast. He knows all the planes and the battles and the major figures of the war. And I myself would have never imagined that I would have written a book about World War II. I just, as I look back as an art historian and as a historian and look back at that era, there's parts of it that are so incredibly disturbing, especially events surrounding the Holocaust that make you want to lose all faith in humanity. But one night, my son invited my husband and myself to come sit with him on the couch and watch a documentary about World War II. And I thought, oh no, I'm gonna, have to steel myself and prepare myself for this. But one of the things that the documentary brought up as just kind of a side topic was this portrait by Leonardo da Vinci that was on the top of the list of the Nazis. And as you probably know, Hitler had plans for a great museum that was going to house all of these old master paintings. And so during World War II, the Nazi regime either stole or tried to steal every known painting by Leonardo da Vinci. They were really seen as kind of the pinnacle of everything they were trying to take and embody for themselves. And so this painting of the lady with the ermine was on the top of their list, and it ended up at the end of the war inside the private home of Hans Frank, who was a high-ranking Nazi leader and the governor of Poland. Some of you may know him as the so-called Butcher of Poland. And as I sat there and heard about this painting hanging on the wall in this man's house, I thought, really? Did that really happen? How did that happen? And so I pulled out my art history books and started going online and reading about this portrait. And I knew the Renaissance history, but I didn't know the World War II history as well. But what really struck me was the fact that in the 15th century, this portrait came about because this young woman, Cecilia Gallerani, who sat for the portrait, was an object of desire for this ruthless, powerful man who would become the Duke of Milan. And then again, in the 20th century, she and her portrait became this object of desire for this ruthless, powerful man. And it was such an interesting juxtaposition, I thought, of historical events, all centered around this one picture, which is so fascinating in and of itself, that I just started going down the research rabbit holes, which is absolutely my favorite thing about writing a book, is doing all the research. But there were so many fascinating parallels between 1492 and 1942. Those numbers just kept sort of flipping back and forth.
True. That's true. Absolutely.
And to see the events, it's just, it was incredible.
There is something so striking, and I almost don't want to use the word evocative, of thinking of this absolutely beautiful epitome of what we think of in terms of art hanging on the wall of the Butcher of Poland. So him looking at the work, admiring it, when it really, obviously it should be in a museum, and to think about the other things that were happening, the other things he was causing to happen in the world around him. And I think that one of the things your book does so well is to talk about this power, like, the power of the Duke of Milan and the power of the governor of Poland, and the idea of taking things, whether of human beings, but also the taking of cultural property. So this idea of the Nazis devastating the cultural resources of Europe and trying to accumulate them all for themselves, whether for Hitler's idea of a museum or for the powerful's own homes. So this looting seems real. The looting of Nazi era seems unprecedented. But of course, we know that powerful people tried to loot all through history,
Yeah.
and so I think that this is such an evocative time that you picked to write about.
Well, you know, when you start to read about the looting of art during World War II, you quickly realize that the scale of it was staggering. I mean, staggering. When you look at all of the paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, all kinds of things, crown jewels from various empires that were hidden away in salt mines, in museum storage rooms and basements all over Europe. It's really nothing short of a miracle that most of those objects made it back where they originally belonged. Of course, there are things that are still missing, and there were things that were not returned, but the vast majority of those precious masterpieces were actually returned to the places where they originally were. And I just find that miraculous. And particularly in the case of Leonardo's Lady with the Ermine, it had so many opportunities to go missing, to be damaged or destroyed, that it's just crazy to realize that it made it back where it came from.
And you trace it so well. It's obviously so well researched, your book. And the characters are also compelling. So you have a young woman who's an art conservator, a German art conservator, and she is working not voluntarily for the Hans Frank, the governor of Poland. And she's along with Cecilia, was one of the heroines of the book.
Yeah, Edith is she's a fictional character. She's a figment of my imagination, but I based her on the many unsung heroes of World War II who worked behind the scenes to try to save works of art. Now, what made Edith interesting to me as a historical novelist was to think about the types of questions that she had to ask herself, you know, and what was that like, I wondered, to be the person who was responsible for actually picking up a painting off of a wall and walking off with it. I mean, just think about that. You know, people who were conscripted to this Nazi effort to steal works of art during World War II were people like you, Susan, and me. They were people who went to school to be art historians or museum professionals. The Kai Muhlmann, who is a character in the book and who was a real person, spearheaded this huge effort to steal works of art during World War II. He was an art historian who had in the not too distant past, written his dissertation on the Baroque fountains of Salzburg, Austria. I mean, you know, very esoteric type, very typical type art history dissertation, right? And I'm sure that he could never imagine himself this kind of mastermind of, you know, works of art from collections across Europe. And there were many art professionals across Germany, art historians, museum curators, art critics, people, artists themselves, who were pulled into this massive effort. And so I just thought, as from a fictional character standpoint, that that would be an interesting problem to explore, and to explore those questions of what that might have been like for them.
Well, it's wonderfully done, and she and then a corresponding character, an American soldier, both separately talk about this struggle between knowing that, well, Edith may not have known everything that was going on with the Holocaust, the struggle between saving lives and saving art. And I think that is such a compelling conundrum for them. They're Dominic, the soldier, is coming across and he sees the devastation, but he's seconded to the monuments men and has to really struggle with himself about what is important. And I think that you handled that so well. And it really made me as the reader think about what is important. But can you talk a little bit about that as well? That balance between life, all of, you mentioned it early, that the devastation, the genocide that was happening in the Holocaust is so devastating, and to balance it with the beauty of art and the importance of our cultural heritage.
Yeah, it's I agree that it's an interesting question, and the character of Dominic is another fictionalized character based on the many unnamed young men and women who were pulled into the war effort. At the beginning of the story, Dominic lands on the Normandy beaches. He is an enlisted private. He doesn't really have any power, but he's an artist himself, and he appreciates art, but that's not really why he's there. He's there to do a job. He understands what's been happening over the last few years. He knows about the concentration camps. He's there to do his job and then go back home to his wife and child as quickly as possible. But he becomes attached to this unit of monuments men. Now, as you may know, the monuments men were also art professionals by and large. These were allied forces, but they pulled museum curators, art historians, people from the universities and museums, architects, people who knew about art and appreciated art. So for these leaders, for these monuments men in powerful positions, there was no conundrum for them, right? They knew the importance of art to a culture and a society, and they were there to save it. That was their job. But for an enlisted private like Dominic, you have to imagine that they must have asked themselves these questions. What is the value of saving a work of art versus saving a human life? And what am I doing here looking for a painting when all of these people are being killed around me? So I thought that also was an interesting thing to explore as in a historical context and in a historical fiction context.
Absolutely, and it's so compelling, you also balance it with just that joy of discovery. So I don't want to reveal too much, but the discovery of the works of art, it's just such a lovely, riveting read as you're tracing these characters as they're going across Germany and Poland. And then of course it's all supported by the story of Leonardo and the model. And so it's been wonderful to go on that journey.
Thank you.
As well. We have a couple of questions from our audience, and one is related to the idea of the repatriation of the Nazi thefts. So we have a question about if a lot of the art was stolen from the Jews, along with religious items from destroyed synagogues. And can you speak to that, the theft specifically from Jewish homes?
Well, that's a whole topic in and of it. So, there have been some really amazing discoveries in very recent years. I mean, like in the last few years, of works of art that were stolen. But the restitution of Jewish art is a whole kind of topic in and of itself. And I think that there are a lot of things out there that still are missing. I know that there are families, Jewish families, who are missing things still. And so I think that we still have a long way to go in learning everything that we can about that, about the theft of Jewish works of art from synagogues or from works of art that were in the hands of Jewish collectors. Certainly the Nazi leaders were well connected with art dealers across Europe, and many of those art dealers were connected with the wealthier Jewish families across Europe, and so a lot of those really valuable works of art did make it into Nazi hands.
Right. And what part of the work that is the important work that museums have to do is to go through what we call provenance research. So any work of art that may have had been in Europe or been around that time, we have to thoroughly research and vet the work of art to make sure it wasn't stolen. And if it was stolen, we ethically must return it to the families. So it's a very important work that we do. And it's not just for Nazi era. We also research and work with tribal groups, tribal nations, to return anything that might possibly have been a grave good from our Native Americans, or a work of cultural heritage. So it's important that we take care of the work and respect the people that owned it and took care of it.
Yeah, it's a good point that you make. And, you see it also in the antiquities trade as well. Things that come to America that are from the ancient Roman period or the ancient Greek period. And sometimes, you run across things that have been stolen. So the provenance research is really critical when something is coming into a collection, for sure.
Absolutely. Well, we have a couple of questions about your previous works. So one of your really beloved books is The Gondola Maker. And Arlene has asked if, Jillian has asked if you had lived in Venice or other parts of Italy. And I think this also gets to this love of your love of Italy that really comes across in your books.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I lived in Europe for about 10 years. A lot of those years were spent in northern Italy. I lived in a tiny little village north of Milan. And yes, my first two novels are set in Venice. The Painter's Apprentice and The Gondola Maker are both set in 16th century Venice. And I have a background in academia. I have a PhD in art history from Yale. I taught at the college level, both in Italy and in the US. And then, when I started publishing, I started with nonfiction, actually. And what fascinated me were the traditional artisans that were still carrying on traditional trades across Italy, people making everything from ceramics to Murano glass to gondolas to all kinds of different things. And it was from that nonfiction research that I moved into historical fiction. So the story of the painter's workshop and the story of the gondola boatyard were things that came out of my academic training and also my nonfiction publishing. But it was just kind of a natural progression. Art history is really about people and stories. And so historical fiction was kind of just a natural place for me to go. I love being in the classroom. I love teaching, and I love my life as an art history professor. But there was a big creative itch that needed to be scratched there. When I was a little girl, I used to always say that I wanted to be a writer. So eventually that came back. And so I feel very privileged to be able to marry the art history with more creative fiction.
Absolutely. And the research, as you mentioned, you can tell you are an art historian. The way you describe the works, the research that have gone into it, the little nuggets that really help to bring the story alive. It's perfectly written. We have a question from Sarah, who asks specifically a little bit maybe about this combination, this marrying of research and being an author. Mm-hmm. So how you found the voice of Leonardo. And I noticed reading it that Leonardo's the only voice that's written in the first person. Yes. And so how you were able to kind of capture that voice and his thoughts of advancing his career and the ties to the wealthy patrons.
Yeah, so Leonardo da Vinci is a character in the story, and when I started this project, my intention was to have Leonardo in one single scene. And it sort of expanded, needless to say. But the scene that I started with this book was actually based on a letter that we have that still exists in Milan. And the letter is from Leonardo da Vinci to Ludovico Sforza, who was at that time the regent of Milan. He had kicked out all of the other heirs and pushed himself to the front of the line. And soon enough, he would become the Duke of Milan. But Leonardo da Vinci was constantly on the lookout for powerful patrons. That was his MO. He was constantly thinking, who can I go work for? Who's the most powerful patron who's going to employ me? Now, he was focused on engineering projects rather than artistic ones. And this is what fascinated me about this letter in Milan. When Leonardo was a young man living in Florence, he made a list and sent it to Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan, and said, I'd like to come work for you, and here are some things that I can do. It was like a resume. He said things like, I can build a machine that will roll into a mine and explode it. I can build a collapsible bridge that will allow troops to run across and then pull it up so no one can chase them. I can build, an armored vehicle. I mean, you would think he was preparing for World War II, the way that he described all of these military contraptions. And then at the very end of the letter, he says, I can also sculpt. And by the way, I can also paint as well as anyone else. So the painting was kind of a footnote in this letter. And I think it is enlightening for us because we think of Leonardo da Vinci as this genius portrait painter, right? But I think during his lifetime, he really was obsessed with these military and engineering projects, and was very interested in going to work for whoever was going to pay him to do that. So I started with that. Now that letter is written in Leonardo's voice. It's written in the first person. It's written in the present. And whenever I start a project, whether it's a short story or a book or whatever, I always start with documents like this, with primary sources, because I think that it helps you really get into the head of the people, the mindset, the mentality of people at the time. You learn what they cared about, what they thought was important to mention. And so with these writings from Leonardo da Vinci, he suddenly sort of comes to life, speaking as if he's speaking to you. And so I just sort of hung on to that and went with it. And as I expanded his other scenes, I felt like it needed to stay in that voice of this man who wrote this letter. So that's where the direction that I went in with Leonardo da Vinci. And he was so much fun to write. I mean, these big historical figures are sometimes tricky, and you bear the burden of, I have another book, The Giant, that came out earlier this year that's about Michelangelo's David. I mean, this one took me 20 years to finish because you carry this huge burden of writing about these towering giants. But there was something about Leonardo da Vinci's voice that just sort of sparked for me, and so much so that I'm still writing about him. Actually, I'm working on my next book, and he plays a role in that as well. And I'm still writing his voice in the same first person present. So, he has a whole interesting history after this portrait of the lady with the ermine. So there's more to come.
I love it. See, he's still inspiring. He's still inspiring. Yes. Well, we have a really wonderful question that from Kathleen. So about the lady with the ermine, and had you ever seen the work in person before writing the novel, or did it inspire the
I've never seen her in person. I'm dying to. She's in Krakow, Poland. And so as soon as we're able to travel again, I'm going to have to get on a plane and go see her.
Yeah.
You know, this painting was restituted to Poland after World War II. It was held under communist rule until the 1990s. It was finally put in the National Museum of Krakow, and it's still there today. Now, it did travel for some years. It did go to several places in the United States. I've had a lot of readers email me or send me messages on Facebook in the last few weeks since the book came out, and they said, oh, I saw this picture when it came to my town when it was on tour. And so I know probably some of you have had the great fortune to see it in real life. So I'll get there.
Yes, me too. Me as well. It is a work that has captivated me since I was taking my first art history
Really?
courses. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. The way she's holding the ermine, her hand, the way he captures the sort of the three-quarter view. It's so captivating.
There is something about it that is very. I don't want to say photographic because it's not, but Leonardo da Vinci has captured a moment. He's captured a moment when this young woman has turned her head almost as if there's something that's distracted her from looking at him, painting her, as if someone's walked in the room or there's a bird that's landed on the windowsill or something. Has made her turn her head. And somehow Leonardo da Vinci has captured this little instant in time. And as you say, then there's something intriguing about the hand and this strange furry white creature in her lap. And, you know, so many questions. You just have so many questions about this woman.
Especially in a poor illustration in a textbook, she has multiple bands on her. So you try to figure out how the veil and the hat and the hair are all worked together.
That's right. Yep.
It's just so wonderful. Sharon is wondering about The Giant, which is, I'm guessing, now available in bookstores, perhaps Magic City Books. And she's wondering if there was a work of art that really inspired you, that got you that spark to get you to writing about The Giant. And I'm guessing it's Il Gigante himself.
Il Gigante, yes, love, beautiful David. So I'll tell you a story. I have 4 children, and they're all teens, and I took them to Italy, and we were there. We were in many, many different places. We started in Rome, we ended in Venice, we meandered everywhere in between. These poor kids, their mom is an art historian, so we went in every museum, we were in every Etruscan tomb, we were all over the place. And when we got back to the US, we sat down for dinner and I asked each one of them to name their top 3 favorite things that they saw. All of them said Michelangelo's David. And I was just really amazed by that because, you know, here is a 500-year-old statue that somehow has the power to captivate 4 American teenagers in the 21st century.
There's everything else.
Yes, I mean that's amazing. And you know, the story of the giant of this colossal marble sculpture is another one that's just an incredible story. Particularly the 4-day journey that this sculpture took from the work yard where Michelangelo sculpted it to its final place in front of the Piazza della Signoria, which is the town hall of Florence. And so that story of the making of the giant was something that, you know, it's a story that I started, I think, as I mentioned, about 20 years ago. My original intention was to write a nonfiction book about it. Actually, it was going to be, you know, in the spirit of Ross King's Brunelleschi's Dome, you know, more of a nonfiction work about it. And when I submitted it to my agent, she loved it. They sent it out. She sent it out to publishers, and they said, "Oh, darn, we just accepted a book just like that." And so I said, well, okay, that's fine. It's not meant to be. It got put back in the drawer. And then I went on with my life. And when I sort of transformed into from a strict art historian into a historical novelist, I said, oh, that story of that sculpture, it was supposed to be a novel instead. And so I guess it was a blessing in disguise that I put this thing away for a long time and then pulled it back out again, because it allowed me to think about the story and tell the story in what I think is maybe a more engaging and an interesting way.
Well, I can't wait. And actually, that's a great connection to Arlene's question, which is how you compare scholarly writing or academic writing or your previous nonfiction writing about the craftspeople in Italy or craftspeople around the world and historical fiction, how you go about that.
So the research is just a joy for me. I really love the research, but writing, and I have a great respect for academic writers, but after working in academia for years, I felt like I was ready to burst because I had this, this creative, need and desire to write fiction. Fiction and nonfiction, I believe, are two completely different animals. I'm a big outliner. I'm kind of an analytical thinker. So in either case, whether I'm writing nonfiction or fiction, I do outline very heavily. The research, of course, is, heavily analytical, kind of nonfiction type activity. But, writing fiction is really different. And so I had to learn a new skill, and I had to learn, a whole new way of approaching a project. A novel is a long, lonely endeavor, and it's you can often get stuck with things. So it's a completely different animal than writing nonfiction, and it's always so amazing how a novel comes together. I'm sure I'm not the only novelist who is just kind of amazed when it all sort of fits together in the end, because there's certain times when you just have no idea how it's all gonna come out, and that's not really the case when you're writing nonfiction. So.
Absolutely, that is true. Well, it fits together very well, and so I can't wait to read The Giant, because the story of David and the construction, it's so compelling. The fact that the stone was dismissed by other artists, other people had worked on it, and so that's such a great topic, and it obviously, like you said, was meant to be your novel, not that scholarly work.
Right.
But what connects the two are the historical research. And one thing I do have to mention is that I loved the little snippet about the depilatory cream. So there's basically a recipe for depilatory cream and how to bleach one's hair with horse urine. So, those kinds, again, it's the snippets that you're like, oh my gosh, you feel like you're in Milan.
Yeah, that's the stuff that I love. When I come across something like that, I just absolutely love it. To come across some little detail that just gives you an idea of, you're suddenly there. When you imagine a woman bleaching her hair with horse urine, suddenly you're in 15th century Milan. I mean, even today I was writing a scene for my next book, and I was trying to figure out how people were playing ball in Florence around the year 1500. And so I went down that research rabbit hole, and I found, some references to people who made balls out of, kind of like packed hay with leather covering. Well, of course it was leather covering because it was Florence, and it was the leather capital, and it still is. And so you can imagine this, leather ball stuffed with hay and children kicking that around in the squares in front of the churches. So little details like that, I think, are what really bring the past to life in a historical novel.
Absolutely. Are you able to share the subject of your new novel, or the setting at least? So it's in Florence.
Yes, it's another dual timeline, Italian Renaissance 20th century story, and it has to do with another portrait. so, so it's a completely different type of different subject and completely different cast of characters, except for Leonardo da Vinci, but a kind of a similar spirit to the night portrait.
Well, I think that it obviously hooked you. Those portraits, and you, the kind of the dual time period and the jumping back and forth, it hooked you. So I look forward to kind of exploring that next one with you. That you do bring in so many historical details and settings, like the piazza that, you know, in front of a church. Lee is asking if you've ever considered adding illustrations or photographs. You do have the photograph, of course, of the lady with an ermine, but to kind of set that stage, or do you like us to imagine the settings ourselves?
Well, I, you know, as an art historian, every time I pick up a novel, I'm like, oh, where are the pictures? So what I have done with my historical novels is I've created a separate section on my website for each novel that I've written. And so there are links in the back of each one of my books to lead you to the correct place that corresponds with that book. But I have kind of like a behind the scenes research vault for each book. And I have videos, you know, posts about all kinds of things. Like, for example, the behind the scenes research vault for my book, The Painter's Apprentice, has a whole section about the plague in the 16th century. It has a whole section about painting pigments in the 16th century. It has a section about people of color in 16th century Venice. It has a section about decorated boxes, which is something that comes up in the story. So anybody who's interested in learning more, particularly if it's a book club who's picked the book to read and they want to learn more, see pictures, see videos, that can all be found on my website. So any one of my books, just pick it up and turn to the back and you'll find the right link to get in and see the fun stuff, the pictures.
Well, one thing before we leave tonight, I do want to mention, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we do have a monuments man that was from Tulsa. And Maurice Davina was born in 1907. It's our statehood. And he became then the first native Oklahoman who graduated and got a degree from the Sorbonne.
Wow.
And he was truly amazing. He was in the 30s, an arts editor, really started the arts column for the Tulsa World, one of our newspapers. And then he was drafted. Because of his language skills and his art knowledge, he worked as a translator across Europe, and he was part of the Monuments Men. And after he was discharged from the army, he stayed in Europe, helping to find the works of art, helping to get them back home. And he also served as a translator and editor for the documents that were used in the Nuremberg trials.
Wow.
Then he later came back to Tulsa and resumed his post at the Tulsa World. He was very integral into the development and the research that went on behind the scenes for the works of art at Philbrook. And at his death, he left a charitable trust, the Maurice Davina Charitable Trust, that allowed Philbrook to purchase multiple works of art, great works of art that really help us trace the history of art. And so I want to thank Maurice Davina for all of his work, both protecting our cultural heritage and also his work here in Tulsa.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That's amazing.
He really was central to the cultural life of Tulsa, and then to know that he also had this footprint in Europe. But before we leave, I have one last question. So I noticed on your website, especially with your work in Venice, that you've done some research on the plague. So, considering the times that we're living in, do you have any hints about how the Venetians handled the plague, quarantining, PPE perhaps, or isolation? How to keep us motivated so that we can continue to have our distance?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And, you want to hear something crazy. About 18 months ago, I was invited to be part of a short story anthology that was focused on the plague. So I joined 8 other authors, and we all wrote short stories about the plague. And we published the book. It's called We All Fall Down. And we published the book on March 1st, not having any clue what was about to happen. And in fact, I was on Zoom earlier today with my co-authors. If you go on YouTube and search, let's see, it's probably the Historical Novel Society of New York City. That's who hosted us today. We talked for about 90 minutes today on this question that you just asked me about.
Really? I didn't know. I had no idea.
Between the plagues of the past and our current pandemic, and it's so fascinating. The Venetian dialect is a whole topic in and of itself, but the word quarantena came from the Venetian word for a period of 40 days. And so our word quarantine is actually a Venetian word. And it was the way that the Venetians handled it was that when merchant ships and other boats came in from elsewhere, they made them stay moored offshore for 40 days. And there were also a series of islands off the coast of Venice where they would have people wait before they could come ashore and unload the merchant ships. Now, a couple of those islands also ended up with plague hospitals on them and plague cemeteries on them. And so it was part of that geography, that special geography of Venice that kind of allowed that. But certainly they had a lot of experience with plague over the various centuries that they had, so many people from all over the world coming into their city. Today, as I spoke with my other co-authors, it was interesting to hear how in different parts of the world, for example, in medieval England or, in other parts of Europe, that people were actually put into kind of a lockdown. One of my co-authors described these little huts that were out in these open fields. And if someone got sick, they would have to go stay in the hut. And then hopefully after a few weeks, they would come back home. Of course, that didn't always happen. It's, one of my co-authors happens to be a physician, and, she said something very interesting, which is, we know a lot more today than we did, of course, during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance about how the disease is passed and how to prevent it, but we don't necessarily know how to treat it much better than people in the Middle Ages or Renaissance might have known how to treat the plague. So that's, really gives you some food for thought.
Right. We're all battling, we're all struggling. And to stay apart, basically what we can learn is to stay apart.
To stay apart, exactly. And, certainly I think we have to recognize that this is not the first time that something like this has ever happened. And, we are just still part of these long threads of history. And it's amazing to see these parallels over the generations. And, writing a dual timeline historical novel, you see these incredible parallels that you just couldn't make up.
That's right. And actually, Francesca, who's joining us today, she says that she was, in fact, part of your Zoom conversation. So
good. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, I can't tell you.
Spending the day with me.
She did. She really did. I can't. She says, prego. I can't tell you how much we appreciate you being here. We have so many comments coming in saying thank you for this wonderful, rich experience. The novel is wonderful. And the a quote from the book that really stuck with me is that the art conservator who's put in this position, she talks about small acts. She has these small acts of resistance that she's able to do and to take with her. And I think no matter where we are, whatever we're dealing with, whether it's with the quarantine or what's going on in our world, we have small acts. And so those small acts, I thought that really stuck with me. And so thank you so much for joining us. I hope that the people on our call enjoy the book, read the book, get it from Magic City Books. Read the book, and I can't wait for the giant. And I hope they also come to Philbrook, go to your local museum and look at a portrait and imagine the story behind the portrait, the person that was painted, the artist, and how that work of art got to the museum. So Laura, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And yes, please don't forget to support your local independent bookstores and your local museums. They really are treasures, and we want to keep them vibrant and alive. So please continue to support those great institutions in your cities.
Yes, we're so lucky to have Magic City Books here in Tulsa and other local bookstores. And so, and we have people that are going through saying thank you that they've connected from California to Oklahoma, from Boston to Oklahoma. So thank you for joining us on this really national call. So awesome. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Magic City Books. And thank you to all.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Thank you, Magic City.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.